What if some of the most incredible stories of the ancient world were never written down? They were carved into mountains, buried beneath the earth, hidden inside tombs, and sometimes left behind as objects whose purpose we still can't explain. An ancient bronze hand buried in Switzerland, a mysterious city hidden in the desert, massive tombs built from stones weighing tons, a prehistoric leopard carved more than 10,000 years ago, and strange stone reliefs showing scenes of violence from a forgotten civilization in Peru. These places and artifacts survived for thousands of years, while the people who created them disappeared. But here's the strange part. We can still see what they left behind, yet in many cases we have no idea what they were trying to tell us. So in this journey, we're going from ancient burial grounds to lost cities, sacred monuments, and mysterious objects buried beneath the earth. And some of these discoveries are going to raise questions that archaeology still can't fully answer, because sometimes the oldest mysteries aren't the ones we haven't discovered, they're the ones we've already found but still don't understand. Let's begin. The Kirakitia circular houses. On a quiet hillside in Cyprus, the remains of an ancient village reveal something remarkable. Thousands of years ago, people were already building carefully planned homes, living together in a permanent settlement, and constructing houses with a design that would continue for generations. These are the circular houses of Kirakitia, one of the most important Neolithic settlements in the eastern Mediterranean. Kirakitia was established around the 7th millennium BC, at a time when farming communities were beginning to transform the way humans lived. People were moving away from constantly travelling in search of food and beginning to build permanent settlements. Kirakitia gives us a rare glimpse into that transition. The settlement was built on the slopes of a hill overlooking the Moroni River Valley. Its position was carefully chosen, close enough to water and fertile land, but elevated above the surrounding landscape. And then there are the houses, instead of rectangular buildings. Many of the structures at Kirakitia were circular. Stone walls formed rounded buildings, while the interiors were divided into different spaces for different activities. Imagine walking through the settlement thousands of years ago. Instead of streets lined with modern-looking houses, you would see clusters of circular stone structures packed closely together across the hillside. People would move between them, prepare food, make tools, and carry out the daily work of the community. The houses were not all identical. Some were larger, some contained multiple internal areas, and the arrangement changed as the settlement developed. This suggests that the community was constantly adapting its living spaces. The walls were built from stone, while other materials were used for roofs and upper sections. The exact appearance of every house may have varied, but the circular plan remained a distinctive feature of the settlement. One of the most fascinating aspects of Kirakitia is the way the buildings were packed together. The settlement was not simply a collection of isolated houses, it was a community. Narrow pathways connected different areas, and the arrangement of the buildings created a dense living environment. People were constantly surrounded by other members of the settlement. This tells us something important. The inhabitants were not living independently. They were part of a society that required cooperation, shared resources, and organised use of space. But what were they doing inside these houses? Archaeologists have discovered stone tools, pottery and other objects, food remains, and evidence of craft activities. These discoveries reveal a community that had already developed a surprisingly complex way of life. They cultivated crops, kept animals, collected wild resources, and manufactured tools. The transition to agriculture did not mean that hunting and gathering suddenly disappeared. The people of Kirakitia continued to exploit the surrounding environment, combining farming with other sources of food. And the settlement itself provides evidence of long-term occupation. Generations of people lived in the same location, rebuilt structures, modified houses, and continued using the landscape. This is important because permanent settlement changes almost everything. Once people invest enormous effort into buildings, storage, fields, and infrastructure, they become connected to a particular place. Kirakitia shows that process happening thousands of years ago. The dead were also connected to the settlement, Burials were sometimes placed beneath the floors of houses. That creates a fascinating connection between the living and the dead. Imagine walking across the floor of a house, knowing that an ancestor was buried beneath it. The boundary between family life and the burial of the dead was not as separate as it is in many societies today. Why were people buried beneath houses? The exact meaning is uncertain. It may have been connected with family traditions, ancestor relationships, or beliefs about the connection between the living and the dead. But the archaeological evidence cannot give us a complete answer. The settlement also reveals a high level of cooperation. Building stone houses, maintaining paths, obtaining food, and supporting the community required organized labor. And yet, we know almost nothing about the individual people who lived there. There are no written records, no royal inscriptions, no historical accounts, just the remains of their homes, their tools, their food, and their burials. That makes Kirakitia especially valuable. It allows archaeology to reconstruct a society that existed thousands of years before written history. Eventually, the settlement was abandoned. The reasons are still debated, but after centuries of occupation, people left Kirakitia, the houses fell into ruin, and the hillside became silent. Thousands of years passed. New civilizations emerged across Cyprus. Different cultures transformed the island, and Kirakitia became a forgotten settlement beneath the earth. Modern archaeological excavations eventually revealed the village again. House after house emerged, along with tools, burials, food remains, and evidence of the community's daily life. Today, the circular houses of Kirakitia are among the most important surviving examples of Neolithic settlement architecture in the Eastern Mediterranean. They show a society learning how to live permanently in one place, building homes, growing food, managing resources, and creating relationships between families and their ancestors. But perhaps the most fascinating thing is how familiar some of it feels. These were people who needed homes, food, tools, family, and protection. They built their houses close together, worked together, and buried their dead within the community. Kirakitia is remarkable because its circular houses preserve a moment when human life was changing. People were beginning to build permanent communities, and those communities were becoming more organized, more connected, and more deeply tied to the landscape around them. The people who lived here left no written history, but their houses survived, stone by stone, floor by floor. They preserved the outline of a village that existed thousands of years before the first cities of the ancient world. And when we walk among those circular walls today, we're not just looking at old buildings, we're looking at the remains of a community, a place where ordinary people once woke up, worked, raised families, buried their dead, and lived their lives more than 7,000 years ago. Tashrabat Caravanserai, high in the mountains of Kyrgyzstan, far from the great cities of the ancient world, a massive stone building sits almost completely alone in a remote mountain valley. No palace, no fortress, but a place built for strangers, merchants, travellers, and caravans crossing one of the most difficult routes in Central Asia. This is Tashrabat, a mysterious stone caravanserai hidden deep in the Tian Shan Mountains. Tashrabat stands at an altitude of more than 3,000 meters, surrounded by steep mountains and open grasslands. Today, the landscape feels incredibly isolated, but centuries ago, this valley formed part of a network of routes connecting Central Asia with China and the wider Silk Road. The building itself is extraordinary, constructed almost entirely from stone. Tashrabat has thick walls, a large central hall, and a series of smaller chambers arranged around it. From the outside, it almost looks like a fortress, but its purpose was different. It was a caravanserai, a roadside shelter where merchants and travellers could stop during long journeys. Imagine arriving here after travelling for days across the mountains. Your caravan would approach the heavy stone entrance, animals would be brought inside, goods would be unloaded, and travellers could finally rest beneath a solid roof. Inside, the central chamber forms the heart of the building. Smaller rooms surround it, providing spaces that could have been used by travellers and their animals. The thick stone construction offered protection from the harsh mountain climate. And the weather here can be brutal. Long winters, freezing temperatures, heavy snow, and powerful winds make travelling through the region extremely difficult. Tashrabat provided something incredibly valuable: shelter. The building also contains a series of underground or partially subterranean chambers, adding another layer of mystery to the structure. Some have wondered whether these spaces served as storage areas, or whether they had other functions. The exact history of Tashrabat is not completely clear. Its present structure is generally associated with the medieval period, but the surrounding region had already been used by travellers and communities for centuries. Its location is what makes it so fascinating. Tashrabat sits along a mountain route leading toward the passes connecting Kyrgyzstan with China. For merchants, the journey was not simply about distance. They had to survive the terrain. A caravan could carry valuable goods: silk, textiles, metal objects, spices, and other products. But every journey depended on stopping places where people could rest, feed their animals, and wait out dangerous weather. Tashrabat was perfectly suited for this. Its stone walls provided protection, its enclosed interior created a secure environment, and its location offered travellers a place to stop before continuing through the mountains. Think about what this place would have sounded like when it was busy. Animals moving across the courtyard, merchants speaking different languages, metal objects clattering, fire burning inside the chambers, and travellers exchanging news from distant regions. This is what makes caravanserais so important. They were not simply hotels, they were meeting points. People from completely different regions could encounter one another, exchange goods, share information, and continue their journeys. The Silk Road was never a single road. It was a huge network of routes, some crossing deserts, others following rivers, and some climbing through mountains like these. Tashrabat belonged to that larger system. But travelling through the Tian Shan was dangerous. Mountain passes could become blocked by snow, weather could change suddenly, and getting lost could be fatal. A reliable shelter along the route could make the difference between continuing the journey and not surviving it. The architecture reflects that harsh environment. The walls are thick, the entrance is relatively narrow, and the building has very few large openings. It feels solid, almost defensive. But that appearance may be misleading. The fortress-like design was practical. A stone structure with thick walls could withstand the climate, protect travellers, and keep warmth inside. The building's dome is another striking feature. The central space rises beneath a large stone-covered roof, creating an enormous interior chamber. Constructing such a structure in this remote mountain environment would have required significant planning and labour. The builders had to obtain stone, shape it, transport it, and raise the structure in a location far from major urban centres. There were no modern roads, no construction cranes, and no powered machinery. The survival of Tashrabat is therefore remarkable. The building has endured centuries of harsh weather, and much of its original stone construction remains standing. But the people who built and used it are largely anonymous. We know the routes they travelled, we can study the building, and we can reconstruct parts of the medieval trade network. But the individual merchants who once slept inside these rooms have disappeared from history. Eventually, the importance of these mountain routes changed, new political boundaries appeared, trade patterns shifted, and transportation systems developed elsewhere. Tashrabat was no longer needed in the same way. The caravans became fewer, the building fell quiet, and the mountain shelter was gradually forgotten. Today, Tashrabat stands almost alone in the landscape. The mountains remain, the grasslands stretch into the distance, and the stone building still occupies the same remote valley. And that isolation can make it difficult to imagine what the place once was. But centuries ago, this was not the middle of nowhere. It was part of a connected world, a world where merchants could travel across thousands of kilometers, carrying goods between distant civilizations. The Akbeshim Buddhist temple, across the dry landscape of northern Kyrgyzstan, the remains of an ancient city lie scattered beneath the open sky. But hidden among those ruins archaeologists uncovered something unexpected: the remains of a Buddhist temple. Far from the great Buddhist centers of India and Central Asia, this is Akbeshim, an ancient city that once stood along the routes of the Silk Road. Akbeshim is located near the modern city of Tokmok, in the Chui Valley of Kyrgyzstan. More than 1,000 years ago, this region was a crossroads between different civilizations, merchants, travelers, religious pilgrims, and armies all moved through the valley. The ancient settlement is generally identified with Suyab, one of the important cities of the medieval Silk Road. Its location was strategically valuable. Routes connected the region with China to the east, Central Asia to the west, and the wider network of trade routes stretching across Eurasia. But the ruins reveal something more than commerce. Archaeologists uncovered the remains of religious buildings, including Buddhist structures, and this is where Akbeshim becomes especially fascinating. Buddhism began thousands of kilometers away in South Asia, yet its ideas eventually traveled deep into Central Asia. Monks, merchants, and travelers carried religious traditions along the same routes used for trade. At Akbeshi, that movement became physical. The remains of a Buddhist temple complex were discovered within the ancient city. Its walls, rooms, and architectural features provide evidence of a Buddhist community operating in this Silk Road environment. Imagine the city during its active period: caravans arriving from distant regions, merchants unloading goods, different languages being spoken in the streets, and somewhere inside the city, Buddhist monks carrying out their religious activities. The temple itself was not simply an isolated building. It belonged to a larger urban environment, where different cultural and religious traditions existed alongside one another. The architecture provides important clues. The complex contained courtyards, rooms, and spaces associated with Buddhist worship. The layout reflects connections with Buddhist architectural traditions found elsewhere in Central Asia. But Akbeshim is particularly valuable because of its location. This was not an isolated Buddhist monastery in the mountains. It was connected to a major Silk Road city. That means religion and trade were operating within the same network. A merchant could travel from one city to another and encounter Buddhist communities along the route. Ideas could move alongside silk, metal, ceramics, and other goods. Archaeologists also discovered evidence of other religious traditions at Akbeshim. Christianity, Zoroastrian traditions, and Buddhism were all present in the broader cultural world of the city. This does not mean everyone practiced the same religion, quite the opposite. The evidence suggests that the city belonged to a multicultural environment where different communities interacted, and that is one of the most important things the ruins reveal. The Silk Road was not simply a commercial highway, it was also a highway for ideas, religions, languages, artistic traditions, technologies, and customs travelled with the people moving across Eurasia. The Buddhist temple is therefore more than an archaeological building. It is evidence of cultural movement. Something that began in South Asia eventually reached this distant valley in Central Asia and took physical form in stone and earth. The city itself experienced political changes over time. Different powers controlled the Chui Valley, and Akbeshim changed as the political landscape shifted. Buildings were modified, new structures appeared, and older ones were abandoned. Eventually, the city declined, trade routes changed, political centres moved, and the settlement was gradually abandoned. Its buildings collapsed, the walls were buried, and the once busy city became ruins. For centuries, the landscape gave little indication of what had once existed here. The city was silent, but beneath the soil, the remains of its temples and buildings survived. Modern archaeological excavations began revealing the ancient settlement, and gradually, the scale and complexity of Akbeshim became clearer. The Buddhist temple was especially important. Its discovery demonstrated that Buddhist communities were not confined to the famous centres further south and east. They were part of the wider cultural landscape of the Silk Road. And perhaps the most fascinating part is the distance. Think about the journey. A religious tradition originating in South Asia, travelling through Central Asian cities, across deserts and mountains, eventually reaching a settlement in what is now Kyrgyzstan. The people who carried those ideas are mostly anonymous. We do not know the names of every monk, every merchant, or every traveller who passed through Akbashim, but the ruins preserve evidence that they were here. The temple stones survived, the foundations remained, and fragments of the ancient city still lie beneath the landscape. Akbashim is remarkable because its Buddhist temple reveals how deeply connected the ancient Silk Road really was, a religion born far to the south, a city positioned deep in Central Asia, and a network of merchants and travellers connecting them together. The temple eventually fell into ruin, the city disappeared, and the routes that once brought people here changed forever. But beneath the Kyrgyz landscape, the remains still survive, a Buddhist temple, inside a Silk Road city, preserving the story of a time when ideas could travel thousands of kilometres and transform a distant city along the road. The Arjan Royal Mounds. On the windswept plains of southern Siberia, enormous stone circles rise from the grasslands. From the surface, they look almost like ordinary burial mounds, but beneath them, archaeologists uncovered evidence of powerful rulers, rich grave goods, and a burial tradition connected with the mysterious world of the ancient Scythians. These are the Arjan Royal Mounds, monumental tombs built on the steppe more than 2,000 years ago. The Arjan burial complexes are located in the Tuva region of southern Siberia, a landscape of wide valleys, mountains, and vast open grasslands. Today, it feels remote, but thousands of years ago, this region was part of a huge world of nomadic cultures moving across the Eurasian steppe. The earliest Arjan mound dates to the 9th century BC, making it one of the earliest monumental burial complexes associated with the early Scythian world, and its construction was enormous. At the centre of the mound, a massive timber burial structure was created. Around it, hundreds of stone blocks formed a huge circular monument. Then, the entire structure was covered by an enormous mound. Imagine the scale of the construction. Trees had to be cut, huge timbers transported, the burial chamber assembled, and enormous quantities of earth and stone moved into place. This was not the work of a small group. It required the cooperation of a large community. But why would so much effort be invested in one burial? The answer may lie in the status of the people buried here. The Arjan mounds appear to have been built for members of the steppe elite, possibly powerful rulers. The burial itself was carefully organised. The central chamber contained the deceased, while other individuals and horses were also placed within the enormous burial complex. The presence of horses is particularly important. For the nomadic societies of the Eurasian steppe, horses were essential. They provided transportation, military power, and status. So placing horses inside a royal burial was not simply practical. It may have symbolized the power and identity of the deceased, and their ability to continue their journey beyond death. Then came the grave goods. Weapons, horse equipment, jewellery, and objects made from precious materials were placed inside the burial complex. The discoveries from the Arjan mounds revealed a society with highly developed metalworking skills. Gold, bronze, and other materials were transformed into elaborate objects. And this is where the famous Scythian animal style becomes important. Animals such as deer, horses, predators, and mythical creatures appear in the art of the steppe cultures. The designs are often energetic, bodies twist, antlers curve, and animals appear locked into dynamic poses. The imagery is instantly recognizable. But these designs were not simply decoration. Animals were deeply important within the symbolic world of the steppe. Exactly what every creature represented remains uncertain, but their repeated appearance suggests that they carried powerful meanings. At Arjan, the archaeological discoveries provide evidence of an elite society that controlled valuable resources, organized large-scale construction, and maintained sophisticated artistic traditions. The second major mound, Arjan II, revealed an even more spectacular collection of gold objects. The burial was discovered largely intact, and the amount of precious material was extraordinary. Thousands of gold objects were recovered, including jewellery, decorative plaques, and animal-style ornaments. The craftsmanship is astonishing. Tiny pieces of gold were shaped into animals, figures, and elaborate decorative elements. Many were attached to clothing or horse equipment, creating an appearance of extraordinary wealth. Imagine the burial ceremony. The deceased dressed in elaborate clothing, gold ornaments covering parts of the garments, weapons and equipment arranged nearby. and horses prepared as part of the funeral. Then, the chamber was closed, the mound was constructed, and the entire world of the deceased disappeared beneath earth and stone. For centuries, the monuments remained on the steppe. Wind crossed the mounds, grass grew over the stones, and the people who had built them vanished from the landscape. The political world that created the burials changed. New groups appeared, and the traditions of the steppe evolved, but the mounds remained. Modern archaeology eventually began investigating them, and the discoveries transformed our understanding of early steppe societies. The royal tombs showed that these communities were capable of enormous construction projects, sophisticated craftsmanship, and complex funerary rituals. The discoveries also demonstrate that the ancient Eurasian steppe was not an empty wilderness. It was a connected world. People, animals, materials, and artistic ideas moved across enormous distances. The animal-style artwork found in the region appears in related forms across the steppe, showing that distant communities shared artistic traditions, even when they lived hundreds or thousands of kilometers apart. And yet, the Arzan mounds still hold mysteries. We cannot identify every person buried there. We cannot reconstruct every ritual, and we cannot be certain what every gold animal originally meant. The objects provide clues, but the people who created the symbolism left no explanation. The Arzan royal mounds are remarkable, because beneath enormous stone and earth monuments lies evidence of a powerful world that existed on the Eurasian steppe more than 2,000 years ago. Kings or elites were buried with weapons, horses, precious objects, and extraordinary gold ornaments. Their craftsmen created animals in gold. Their communities moved enormous stones, and their monuments transformed the open steppe into a landscape of royal memory. Then, the people disappeared, their kingdoms changed, their burial traditions faded, and the mounds became silent. But the gold survived, and when archaeologists finally opened these ancient burials, they discovered something extraordinary, not just treasure, but evidence of a sophisticated steppe civilization that had been hidden beneath the earth for thousands of years, the Tel Caramel Towers. In northern Syria, on the banks of the Euphrates, archaeologists uncovered the remains of something that seemed far too advanced for its age. Tall circular towers, built thousands of years before the famous cities of Mesopotamia, at a time when humans were only beginning to settle permanently. This is Tel Caramel, and its towers may belong to one of the earliest monumental building traditions ever discovered. Tel Caramel lies just north of modern Aleppo, near the Euphrates River. Today, the site appears as an archaeological mound, but beneath those layers of earth, researchers uncovered the remains of a settlement that was already developing complex architecture extremely early in human history. The earliest occupation of Tel Caramel dates back to around the 10th millennium BC, a period when many communities were still living as hunter-gatherers, and permanent settlements were only beginning to emerge. And then, the towers appear. 5 circular structures have been identified at the site, built and rebuilt over long periods of occupation. Their exact purpose remains uncertain. They were not simple houses. The structures were carefully constructed, with circular walls, stone foundations, and substantial internal spaces. Their unusual design has led archaeologists to consider several possible functions. Could they have been lookout towers, community buildings, ritual spaces, or something connected with defense? The evidence does not provide one definitive answer. But their age is what makes them extraordinary. If the earliest phases are correctly dated, these structures existed thousands of years before many of the monumental buildings traditionally associated with the rise of civilization. Imagine the landscape at the time. There were no cities like the ones that would later dominate Mesopotamia, no giant temples, no written records, no kings ruling enormous kingdoms. Yet people were already building substantial structures together. That tells us something important. Monumental architecture did not suddenly appear with the first cities. Its roots may reach much further back, to communities that were experimenting with permanent settlement and collective construction. The people of Tel Caramel were also adapting to a changing way of life. They hunted animals, collected wild plants, and increasingly relied on cultivated foods and domesticated resources. The settlement therefore belongs to a crucial period in human history. People were gradually changing from highly mobile lifestyles toward more permanent communities, and architecture became part of that transformation. The towers may have provided shared spaces where people gathered, worked, stored materials, or performed activities that archaeologists can no longer fully reconstruct. The problem is that the builders left no written explanation. There are no inscriptions telling us, "This tower was built for this purpose." We have only the structure itself and the objects found around it. That makes every detail important. The position of the walls, the entrances, the internal arrangement, and the layers of rebuilding can all provide clues. And the towers were not built once, they were modified over time. Older structures were abandoned, new ones appeared, and the settlement continued to change. This suggests that the buildings remained important for generations. Whatever their original function, the community repeatedly returned to the same architectural tradition. The surrounding settlement also reveals everyday life: stone tools, animal remains, plant remains, and other artifacts provide evidence of what people were eating, making, and using. These discoveries help place the towers within their wider environment. They were not isolated monuments, they belonged to a living community. And that may be the most fascinating part. The people who built these structures were not living in a fully developed urban civilization. They were part of a much earlier world, yet they were already capable of organizing labor and constructing substantial buildings. This challenges the simple idea that complex architecture only appeared after agriculture and cities. Human communities were experimenting with new forms of organization much earlier. Then, thousands of years passed. Tel Caramel was occupied, abandoned, reoccupied, and eventually left behind. The settlement became buried beneath layers of earth. The towers disappeared from the landscape, and their builders became completely unknown. For millennia, nobody knew that these structures had ever existed. Modern archaeological excavations eventually began revealing the settlement. Layer by layer, the ancient buildings emerged, and the circular towers became some of the site's most important discoveries. The discoveries helped researchers reconsider the development of early architecture in the Near East. Before the great cities, before the monumental temples, before writing, there were already communities capable of creating large shared structures. But the mystery remains. What exactly happened inside these towers? Were people gathering there? Were they protecting something? Were they performing rituals? Or did their purpose change over the centuries? Perhaps there was never a single answer. A structure could have been used differently by different generations, its function changing as the settlement itself evolved. Tel Caramel is remarkable because its towers push the story of monumental architecture deep into prehistory. Long before the great cities of Mesopotamia, people were already constructing substantial circular buildings, organizing communities, and transforming the landscape around them. We know the towers existed. We can study their construction, we can date their layers, but the people who built them left us no explanation. Their settlement eventually disappeared. The towers collapsed, and the earth covered everything. But thousands of years later, archaeologists uncovered the remains, and suddenly, a forgotten community from the dawn of settled life began to emerge again, leaving behind towers whose true purpose may still be waiting to be understood. The Kainua Sacred Well. In the ruins of an ancient Etruscan city, archaeologists uncovered a place where people came to leave offerings beneath the ground. A deep, sacred well, bronze figures, weapons, and objects deliberately placed into the darkness. This was Kainua, the ancient Etruscan city of Marzabotto, and hidden within its ruins was evidence of rituals that reveal a much more mysterious side of Etruscan life. Kainua was built in northern Italy, near the modern town of Marzabotto. Unlike many ancient settlements that developed slowly over centuries, Kainua was laid out according to a remarkably organized plan. Straight streets, regular blocks, workshops, homes, temples, and public spaces created a carefully structured city. The city flourished during the 6th and 5th centuries BC, at a time when the Etruscans were one of the most influential cultures in pre-Roman Italy. They traded across the Mediterranean, built wealthy cities, and developed distinctive religious traditions. But beneath the organized streets, there was another world, the sacred wells. These were not simply sources of water. Some were connected with ritual activity, where objects could be deliberately deposited underground. Imagine approaching one of these sacred spaces thousands of years ago. There would be no monumental temple towering above you. Instead, a carefully prepared opening descended into the earth. Inside, the darkness concealed objects that had been intentionally placed there. Among the discoveries are small bronze statuettes, human figures, animals, and other objects associated with Etruscan religious practices. The statuettes are particularly fascinating. Some depict people standing, others appear to represent worshippers or supernatural figures. Their small size allowed them to be carried, handled, and deliberately deposited. But why place a valuable bronze figure inside a well? One possibility is that it was an offering to a deity. The object was removed from the world of the living and given to the sacred space beneath the ground. This type of ritual deposition appears in different forms across the ancient Mediterranean. Valuable objects could be placed in wells, rivers, caves, or other locations believed to have religious significance. The Etruscans had a complex religious system, and natural features could become important sacred places. Water in particular could have powerful associations with the boundary between the human world and the divine. But we have to be careful. We cannot know the exact meaning of every object found inside the well. There is no single inscription explaining the ritual, and different deposits may have had different purposes. The bronze figures nevertheless tell us something important. The people of Kainua were not simply building temples, they were interacting with the landscape itself. The ground, the water, and underground spaces could all become part of religious practice. And the city around these sacred spaces was highly organized. Kainua was divided into carefully planned urban blocks, with roads intersecting at regular angles. This is one of the most impressive features of the settlement. The city was deliberately designed, rather than simply growing randomly around older buildings. That planning reflects a society with strong organizational abilities. Land had to be measured, streets laid out, buildings constructed, and public and religious spaces carefully positioned. The city also had workshops and industrial areas. Etruscan craftsmen produced ceramics, metal objects, and other goods. Trade helped connect Kainua with surrounding regions. So Kainua was both practical and sacred. People worked, traded, built homes, and participated in rituals within the same carefully organized city. The sacred wells provide a glimpse into the beliefs behind that world. A bronze figure could be taken away from everyday life, carried to a sacred location, and lowered into the earth. Perhaps the ritual involved a prayer, a request for protection, a dedication to a deity, or an offering connected with a particular event. The object would then disappear, no longer visible, no longer useful as an ordinary possession. It became part of the sacred landscape. And this may explain why some of these discoveries are so valuable archaeologically. The objects were deliberately placed, meaning they were not simply lost. Their location was part of their meaning. Eventually, Kainua's fortunes changed, political power shifted, trade networks evolved, and the city gradually lost its importance. The settlement was eventually abandoned, its streets became silent, buildings collapsed, and vegetation covered parts of the ruins. The sacred wells remained. Objects that had been placed inside them centuries earlier stayed beneath the surface, protected by the earth. Modern excavations eventually uncovered the ancient city, revealing its streets, temples, workshops, homes, and ritual spaces. The bronze statuettes and other offerings helped archaeologists reconstruct a side of Etruscan society that monumental architecture alone cannot reveal. They show how ordinary objects could become part of religious ceremonies, and how the underground world could hold a sacred meaning. The Kainua sacred well is remarkable because beneath one of the most carefully planned Etruscan cities, People were deliberately placing objects into the darkness, bronze statuettes, offerings, and objects whose original meanings are now partly lost. We can see where they were deposited, we can study what they were made from, and we can reconstruct the city that surrounded them. But we cannot hear the prayers that accompanied them. We cannot know exactly what the people hoped to receive, or what they believed was waiting beneath the earth. The Etruscans eventually disappeared into the expanding Roman world. Kainua became a ruin, and the sacred spaces fell silent. But deep underground, their offerings remained, quietly preserving the traces of rituals performed more than 2,000 years ago. The Fanshan Royal Burials. In the wetlands of ancient China, archaeologists uncovered a cemetery unlike anything ordinary. Beneath the earth were enormous tombs, precious jade, ceremonial objects, and evidence of rulers who belonged to one of China's earliest complex societies. This is Fanshan, the royal cemetery of the Liangzhu culture. Fanshan is located near the ancient Liangzhu city in present-day Zhejiang, a region filled with rivers, wetlands, and low hills. More than 5,000 years ago, this landscape was home to a society that had already developed enormous settlements, sophisticated water systems, specialized craftsmen, and powerful elites. But the most extraordinary evidence comes from the cemetery. At Fanshan, large burial pits were constructed for high-status individuals. The tombs were carefully arranged, and many contained extraordinary collections of jade. Jade was extremely important to the Liangzhu people. They shaped it into ritual objects, decorative pieces, weapons, and ornaments. But producing jade objects was incredibly difficult. Jade is hard, very hard. Ancient craftsmen had to grind and polish the stone for enormous amounts of time, using abrasive materials and painstaking techniques. A single elaborate object could represent a huge investment of labor. And some of these objects were placed inside the royal tombs. That tells us something about the people buried at Fanshan. These were not ordinary members of the community. They belonged to an elite capable of controlling labor, resources, and highly valued materials. Among the most famous Liangzhu objects are the Kong, large jade tubes with square outer sides and circular inner openings. Their exact meaning remains uncertain, but they appear repeatedly in elite burials. Another important object is the Zhe, a flat circular jade disc with a hole through its center. These objects are found in high-status burials, often alongside other ceremonial jade pieces. Imagine entering one of these tombs thousands of years ago. The deceased would lie surrounded by carefully arranged jade objects, each polished, shaped, and positioned deliberately. The burial itself became a display of status. The sheer quantity of jade is remarkable. Some tombs contain dozens of jade objects, while particularly important burials contained much larger collections. This raises an obvious question. Why jade? The material was difficult to obtain and difficult to work, yet Liangzhu elites invested enormous effort into it. The answer may be connected with ritual and authority. The objects may have represented religious beliefs, social rank, political power, or relationships between humans and supernatural forces, but the exact meanings are still debated. What is much clearer is the social hierarchy. Not everyone in Liangzhu society was buried with enormous quantities of jade. The difference between ordinary burials and elite tombs suggests a society with significant differences in status. And Fanshan is part of a much larger picture. Nearby, the ancient city of Liangzhu covered a huge area. It included monumental structures, residential zones, work areas, and an extraordinary system of water management. The water system is particularly impressive. Dams and channels were constructed to control water across the landscape. The people of Liangzhu were not simply adapting to the wetlands, they were actively engineering them. That required organization. Thousands of people may have participated in building and maintaining these systems. The royal cemetery provides another clue to how that society was organized. The tombs suggest that certain individuals possessed extraordinary authority. They could command labor, control valuable materials, and participate in rituals that were unavailable to everyone else. This is why the Fanshan Cemetery is so important. It gives archaeologists a direct look at the people at the top of Liangzhu society. Instead of only studying their buildings, we can study what they were buried with. and the objects reveal remarkable craftsmanship. The jade surfaces were polished, edges carefully shaped, and intricate patterns produced with astonishing precision. Some jade! Objects carry the mysterious Tauti-like or mask imagery associated with Liangzhu art. The repeated motifs suggest that these designs had symbolic significance, but again, the people who created them left no written explanation. There were no texts telling us exactly what the symbols meant, no surviving religious books, no royal inscriptions, no written descriptions of the burial ceremonies. So archaeologists have to reconstruct the meaning from patterns. Which objects appear together? Where were they placed? Who received them? And how did the burial practices change over time? These questions are helping researchers understand Liangzhu society. But some mysteries remain. We still cannot fully reconstruct the political structure, the exact role of individual rulers, or the precise beliefs associated with every jade object. Eventually, the Liangzhu civilization declined. The great city was abandoned. Water management systems stopped being maintained, and the society that had created them disappeared. The reasons remain debated: environmental changes, flooding, social disruption, or a combination of factors may have played a role. But the result was dramatic. A powerful society faded away. The Fanshan tombs, however, preserved a remarkable record of that vanished world. The jade remained underground, protected from the elements, while the civilization above it disappeared. Thousands of years later, archaeologists excavated the cemetery. One jade object after another emerged from the soil, revealing a society far more complex than previously imagined. The Fanshan royal burials are remarkable because they preserve the wealth and beliefs of one of China's earliest complex civilizations. Beneath the earth, elite individuals were buried with extraordinary collections of jade, objects that required enormous amounts of skill and labor to produce. The tombs reveal hierarchy, craftsmanship, ritual, and a society capable of monumental engineering. But the people who ordered these burials left us no written explanation. We don't know exactly what their jade objects meant, or what was said during the ceremonies. We only have the tombs, the jade, and the silent remains of a civilization that eventually disappeared. And perhaps that is what makes Fanshan so fascinating. Thousands of years after the Liangzhu world vanished, its rulers are still speaking through the objects they chose to take with them. The Abydos Unknown Pharaoh tomb, beneath the desert at Abydos. Archaeologists uncovered a royal tomb that should have carried the name of its king, but the name is gone. Ancient tomb robbers damaged the inscriptions, the burial was looted, and the identity of the pharaoh disappeared with it. All that remains is a massive royal tomb, and a mystery surrounding one of the least understood periods in ancient Egyptian history. The tomb was discovered in January 2025, nearly 23 feet beneath the desert surface, at the ancient necropolis of Anubis Mountain at Abydos, and its size immediately caught the attention of archaeologists. The limestone burial chamber is substantially larger than the tomb of another Abydos ruler discovered in 2014, King Seneb K. The tomb dates to roughly 3,600 years ago, during the Second Intermediate Period, one of the most politically complicated chapters in Egyptian history. Egypt was not controlled by a single unified kingdom at this time. Different rulers controlled different regions, and rival kingdoms competed for power. In the north, the Hyksos controlled much of Egypt. In the south, the rulers of Thebes held their own territory, and somewhere between these competing powers, a small group of kings ruled from Abydos. This little-known line became known as the Abydos dynasty. For a long time, these rulers were barely understood. Some were known only from fragments of inscriptions. Others appeared to have completely disappeared from the historical record. Then, archaeology began finding their tombs. In 2014, the tomb of King Seneb K was discovered at Abydos. That discovery provided some of the strongest archaeological evidence for the existence of the Abydos dynasty. Now, another royal tomb has emerged from the same landscape, and this one may be even more important. The entrance leads toward an enormous limestone burial chamber, covered by massive mud brick vaults. The vaults once rose roughly 16 feet high, creating a huge protected space above the royal burial. The entrance was decorated with painted scenes. The goddesses Isis and Nephthys appeared within the funerary decoration, figures strongly associated with protection, mourning, and the journey of the dead. And somewhere within those painted inscriptions, the king's name was originally written. That should have solved the mystery, but it didn't. Ancient tomb robbers damaged the decoration, and the surviving hieroglyphs are too incomplete to securely identify the ruler. So today, archaeologists know that a king was buried here, but they don't know exactly which king. There are possible candidates. 2 rulers named Sennaib and Pentgeni are known from monuments at Abydos, yet their tombs have never been securely identified. There is another possibility. Because the tomb appears to be older than Seneb K's, and because it is considerably larger, researchers believe it may have belonged to one of the earlier rulers of the Abydos dynasty. That makes the size particularly interesting. Why would a relatively obscure regional king receive such a monumental burial? The answer may be that these rulers were more powerful than surviving historical records suggest. The tomb itself is evidence of royal ambition. Thousands of stones had to be prepared. Workers had to excavate deep into the desert. The limestone chamber had to be constructed, and enormous mud brick vaults had to be raised above it. This was a major construction project. But when archaeologists entered the tomb, they found something very different from the royal treasures we might expect. It had already been heavily looted in antiquity. The sarcophagus was gone, the mummy was gone, and the burial goods had disappeared. The tomb robbers may have taken the most valuable objects thousands of years ago, but ironically, their destruction left behind something else: the architecture, the inscriptions, and the layout of the tomb. These surviving details can still tell archaeologists how this unknown king was buried, and how his tomb compares with those of other Abydos rulers. The location itself is significant. Abydos was one of ancient Egypt's most sacred places. It was closely associated with Osiris, the god of the underworld and resurrection. The area therefore carried enormous religious importance. For Egyptian rulers, being buried at Abydos was not simply about being placed in a tomb. It connected the king with one of the most powerful religious landscapes in Egypt, and this may help explain why rival rulers continued to build royal tombs here, even during a period when Egypt itself was politically divided. The newly discovered tomb therefore provides more than another burial. It gives archaeologists another piece of evidence for understanding a forgotten political world, a time when Egypt had multiple competing centres of power, and when small royal dynasties could rise and disappear within a few generations. The most fascinating question remains: who was the king? Was he one of the rulers already known from inscriptions? Was he a predecessor of Seneb K? Or does the tomb belong to a pharaoh whose name has completely disappeared from Egyptian history? Further excavation and conservation work at the site may help answer that question. Researchers are also using techniques such as remote sensing, magnetic mapping, and 3-dimensional recording to investigate the surrounding necropolis. And there may be more tombs nearby. The newly discovered burial sits within a larger royal landscape, where archaeologists have already identified other mysterious royal structures. That means this discovery may not be the end of the story. It could be another piece of a much larger royal cemetery, a cemetery belonging to rulers who were almost completely forgotten. The Abydos unknown, pharaoh tomb, is remarkable because it gives us the rare chance to stand before a royal burial and still not know the name of the king who built it. The chamber is enormous. The decoration once carried his identity, and the tomb was clearly designed for a ruler, but ancient robbers destroyed the evidence that could have told us who he was. Today, only fragments remain: a damaged inscription, a massive limestone chamber, and a royal tomb buried deep beneath the desert. The king's treasures are gone. His mummy is gone. Even his name has almost disappeared. But his tomb survived, and thousands of years later, archaeologists are finally trying to give a forgotten pharaoh his identity back. The Karahan Tepe leopard sculptures deep in southeastern Turkey. Archaeologists uncovered something that seems almost impossible for its age: a human figure, a powerful leopard, and a monumental complex carved by people who lived thousands of years before the first cities. This is Karahan Tepe, and its strange sculptures are forcing archaeologists to rethink what prehistoric communities were capable of. Karahan Tepe lies in the Şanlıurfa region of southeastern Turkey, within the same extraordinary archaeological landscape as Göbekli Tepe. The site dates back to the 10th millennium BC, a time when many people were still living as hunter-gatherers. There were no cities like the ones that would later rise in Mesopotamia. Yet here, people were already creating monumental architecture and elaborate stone sculptures. And then there is the leopard. The animal appears in the site's extraordinary collection of carved stone figures, alongside humans, birds, snakes, and other animals. The imagery is powerful and sometimes deliberately unsettling. The leopard was not carved as a simple naturalistic animal. Its body, head, and posture were carefully shaped into the stone, creating a powerful creature that seems to emerge from the prehistoric architecture. But the most fascinating discoveries at Karahantepe are the human representations. Some sculptures appear strangely realistic, while others are highly stylized. One famous seated human figure has a particularly unusual expression, almost as if the person is staring directly into the space around them. Why were these figures created? That is still one of Karahantepe's biggest mysteries. The site does not provide written explanations, so archaeologists have to reconstruct its meaning from the architecture, the sculptures, and their archaeological context. Karahantepe was not simply a place where people lived. Some of its structures appear to have been deliberately designed for communal or ceremonial activities. Large carved spaces, stone pillars, and sculpted figures created an environment unlike an ordinary settlement. Imagine entering one of these spaces thousands of years ago. You would encounter massive stone elements, carved human forms, and animals emerging from the walls and surfaces. The experience must have been powerful. And that is what makes the leopard so interesting. It belongs to a visual world where humans and dangerous animals appear together. The animals may have represented power, danger, protection, or supernatural forces, but those interpretations remain uncertain. The leopard itself would have been an impressive predator. Its presence in prehistoric art suggests that people were closely observing the animals around them and giving them symbolic importance. But Karahantepe raises an even bigger question. Why were communities capable of producing monumental art before the development of fully urban civilization? The traditional story of civilization often begins with agriculture, then permanent villages, then cities, then monumental architecture, but sites like Karahantepe complicate that sequence. Here, people were already organizing labor, working massive stones, creating elaborate sculptures, and constructing communal spaces extremely early in human history. That does not mean Karahantepe was a city in the later Mesopotamian sense. It wasn't. But it demonstrates that complex social organization and monumental construction existed much earlier than the first true urban centers. The craftsmanship is remarkable. The sculptures were carved directly from local stone, using prehistoric tools and enormous amounts of labor. The artist had to understand the shape of the rock, remove material carefully, and create recognizable human and animal forms. And the sculptures were not necessarily isolated objects. Some were integrated into the architecture itself, making the entire building part of the artistic composition. This suggests that the people who created Karahantepe were thinking about architecture and sculpture together. The building was not simply a shelter. It could become a stage for symbolic imagery. Then, something changed. The site was eventually abandoned or transformed, and the monumental structures were deliberately filled in. Large quantities of soil and stone were placed into some of the structures. Why? That remains another mystery. Perhaps the buildings had reached the end of their ritual lives. Perhaps the community changed, or perhaps the act of filling them was itself part of a ceremony. Whatever the reason, the burial of the structures helped preserve them. The sculptures remained hidden beneath the earth, waiting for thousands of years. Modern archaeological research eventually returned to the site, and each excavation season has revealed more of this extraordinary prehistoric world. The discoveries at Karahantepe are changing how researchers think about the origins of monumental architecture, religion, art, and social organization. And the leopard is one of the clearest reminders of just how unusual this world was. A dangerous animal, carved into stone, inside a monumental complex, created by people living more than 10,000 years ago. We don't know exactly what the leopard represented. We don't know what ceremonies took place around it, or what stories the people told about these animals, but the sculpture tells us that the natural world was deeply important to them. The Karahantepe leopard sculpture is remarkable. because it comes from a time when monumental art was supposedly still centuries away. A prehistoric community created powerful human and animal sculptures, built enormous stone structures, and transformed their landscape into a place filled with symbolism. The leopard survived, the buildings survived, but the meaning behind them disappeared. Today, we can still see the creature carved into the stone, still carrying the power of a predator, still surrounded by the remains of a mysterious prehistoric world. And perhaps the biggest mystery is not the leopard itself, but the people who carved it. How did a society living thousands of years before the first cities develop the knowledge, organization, and imagination to create something like this? The Kujowy megalithic tombs. The monuments are found in the Kujowy region of central Poland, an area that today looks surprisingly ordinary. Fields, open farmland, and gentle landscapes. But beneath this landscape, archaeologists have found some of the most impressive prehistoric monuments in northern Europe. The tombs were constructed during the Neolithic period, when farming communities were spreading across Europe. These people had already begun living in permanent settlements, growing crops, keeping animals, and building monuments that required enormous amounts of collective labour. The most striking feature of the Kujowy tombs is their shape. They are extremely long, often narrowing toward one end, creating enormous triangular or trapezoidal mounds. From above, they almost look like giant stone arrows pointing across the landscape. The builders created the monuments using earth, stone, and wooden structures. Large stones were placed along the sides, creating monumental boundaries around the burial area. Some of these stones are enormous. Moving them would have required careful planning, strength, and cooperation. There were no machines, no modern roads, and no cranes, only people, simple tools, ropes, wood, and an enormous amount of labour. So why build something this large? The answer appears to be connected with the dead. These monuments were used as burial structures, and may have served as important ceremonial places for the communities that created them. At the narrower end, a smaller burial chamber could be constructed. The wider end formed the monumental front of the tomb. This created an unusual architectural design, one that seems to deliberately emphasize the approach toward the burial. Imagine approaching one of these monuments thousands of years ago. The tomb would have risen above the surrounding landscape, its stone sides clearly visible, and its enormous mound dominating the area around it. These were not hidden graves. They were monumental statements. The dead were being placed within structures that remained visible for generations. That suggests the tombs may have been connected with ancestry. The people buried inside may have remained important to the communities that came after them. The monument itself preserved their presence. But there is a fascinating mystery. The tombs are enormous, yet the number of human remains found inside some of them can be surprisingly small. This raises questions about who was selected for burial. Were these tombs reserved for important individuals, community leaders, ancestors, or did the burial practices change over time? Archaeology has not provided one simple answer. The monuments may also have been used for ceremonies that involved far more people than those actually buried inside. The tomb was not necessarily just a grave. It may have been a place where the living gathered, remembered their ancestors, and performed rituals. The surrounding landscape is important too. The tombs were constructed in areas where prehistoric communities were farming and settling. They were part of a wider cultural landscape, not isolated monuments. The people who built them were capable of organizing substantial communities. Agriculture required fields, animals required management, settlements required construction, and monumental tombs required coordinated labor. This tells us something important about Neolithic society. These communities were not simply small groups struggling to survive. They were capable of undertaking projects that required long-term planning. The construction itself must have been a major event. Trees may have been cleared, earth gathered, stones transported, and the mound gradually raised over the burial chamber. Generation after generation, the monument could remain visible. A child growing up near the tomb would see the same structure that their parents had known, and perhaps their grandparents as well. Over time, the landscape changed. New settlements appeared, agricultural practices developed, and later cultures replaced the communities that had built the tombs. But the long barrows remained. Some were damaged by farming, others were gradually flattened, and many disappeared beneath the modern landscape. Modern archaeology has allowed researchers to locate and investigate the surviving monuments, using excavation, aerial photography, geophysical surveys, and increasingly sophisticated landscape archaeology. These methods can reveal structures that are difficult to see from the ground: buried ditches, stone alignments, internal chambers, and traces of prehistoric activity can appear beneath modern fields. This is especially important in Kujawi. Because the modern landscape can hide the scale of the ancient monuments, a field may look completely ordinary, until archaeological survey reveals a prehistoric structure beneath it. The tombs also connect the Kujawi region with a much wider tradition of megalithic construction. Across parts of Europe, Neolithic communities built long barrows, passage graves, dolmens, and other monumental burial structures. But each region developed its own traditions. The Kujawi tombs have their own distinctive shape, construction techniques, and relationship with the surrounding landscape. And perhaps the most impressive thing is their age. These monuments were created thousands of years before the pyramids of Egypt, before Stonehenge reached its later monumental form, and long before the first written records of European history. The people who built them had no written language that tells us their story. We don't know the names of their leaders, their gods, or the exact words spoken during their funerals. We only have the monuments, the stones, the earth, the burials, and the landscape they deliberately transformed. The Hopewell copper ear spools. Deep beneath the earth of Ohio, archaeologists uncovered something that reveals just how far ancient American trade networks could reach. Large copper ornaments, carefully shaped, highly polished, and buried with people who lived nearly 2,000 years ago. These are the Hopewell copper ear spools, striking ornaments from one of the most sophisticated ancient cultures of eastern North America. The Hopewell tradition flourished across parts of the eastern United States, especially in the Ohio River Valley, between roughly the 1st century BC and the 5th century AD. These communities built enormous earthworks, created elaborate ceremonial landscapes, and participated in trading networks that stretched across huge distances. Among their most impressive possessions were copper ornaments worn as ear decorations. Some were shaped as large circular discs, others had intricate designs, and many were carefully polished until the copper surface became bright and reflective. But the most remarkable thing is where the copper came from. Much of the copper used by Hopewell craftsmen appears to have originated in the Great Lakes region, hundreds of kilometers away from many Hopewell sites in Ohio. That means the material itself traveled. Raw copper was obtained, transported across enormous distances, and eventually transformed into ceremonial objects. Imagine the journey. A piece of copper extracted near the Great Lakes, moved through forests and rivers, passed between different communities, and eventually arriving in Ohio. There, a skilled craftsman shaped it into an ornament. The finished object could then become part of a person's identity, status, or ceremonial role, and eventually, some of these ornaments were placed inside burial mounds. This is where archaeology becomes especially interesting. The Hopewell people built enormous earthworks and burial mounds, and some contained remarkably rich collections of objects: copper ornaments, mica, obsidian, shell, pearls, and other materials were sometimes brought together in the same ceremonial context. Many of these materials came from completely different regions. Obsidian could travel from the Rocky Mountains, marine shell could come from the Gulf Coast, copper came from the Great Lakes, and mica was obtained from regions farther east. Put all of that together, and the Hopewell world begins to look like a massive network. People were connected across much of eastern North America, long before European contact. The copper ear spools are therefore more than pieces of jewellery. They are evidence of movement, exchange, craftsmanship, and social connections. But who wore them? That is much harder to answer. Some were found in burials, and the individuals buried with elaborate objects may have held important positions within their communities. The ornaments may have signalled status, identity, religious roles, or membership in particular social groups, but there is no surviving written record explaining exactly what they meant. The craftsmanship itself is extraordinary. Copper could be hammered, cut, folded, and shaped into thin sheets. The surface could then be polished, creating a striking appearance. The craftsman had to control the metal carefully. Too much force could break or deform it, while insufficient work would leave the surface rough. Creating large symmetrical ornaments required considerable skill. And then, there is the question of why copper was so important. Copper is visually striking, but it also had to be transported long distances. The effort involved in acquiring it made it valuable. A copper ornament therefore carried more than material value. It could represent access to distant resources, connections with other communities, and the ability to participate in a much larger exchange system. The Hopewell ceremonial centres themselves reveal the scale of this society. Massive earthworks were constructed, geometric shapes were laid out across the landscape, and burial mounds were carefully positioned. Some earthworks form enormous circles, others create geometric enclosures, and some are aligned with astronomical events. They're exact. Meanings remain debated, but their construction clearly required planning. The people who built these monuments did not have metal machinery, wheeled vehicles, or draft animals like those used in later civilizations, yet they moved enormous quantities of earth and created structures that still survive today. The copper ornaments belong to this same world, a society capable of monumental earthworks, long-distance exchange, and highly specialized craftsmanship. Eventually, the Hopewell tradition changed. The great ceremonial centers were abandoned or used differently, trade networks shifted, and the communities that had built the monuments developed new traditions. But the earthworks remained, and beneath some of them, the copper ornaments remained with the dead. For centuries, the mounds stood across the landscape, forests grew around them, new communities arrived, and the original meaning of the monuments gradually disappeared. Modern archaeology eventually opened some of these ancient burials, and the copper objects emerged again. Their surfaces could still reflect light, even after centuries underground. These discoveries transformed our understanding of ancient North America. The Hopewell world was not isolated. It was connected by enormous networks of exchange, through which materials, objects, and ideas travelled across the continent. And perhaps the strangest part is the journey of the copper itself, a material taken from distant mines, carried hundreds of kilometres, transformed into a beautiful ornament, and finally buried with someone who lived nearly 2,000 years ago. The Hopewell copper ear. Spools are remarkable because a simple piece of metal reveals an enormous ancient network. The copper travelled, the craftsman transformed it, and the finished ornaments became part of a world of ceremony, identity, and status. We don't know exactly who wore every ornament, or what each design meant, but we know the objects were valuable enough to travel extraordinary distances, and important enough to be placed in sacred burial contexts. The people who created them eventually disappeared. Their ceremonial centres fell silent, but the copper survived, and today, those ancient ornaments still tell a remarkable story of a North American society connected by trade and ideas across hundreds of kilometres. Long before the modern world ever existed, the Monte Sierpe band of holes. Across the dry landscape of coastal Peru, thousands of small holes stretch across the ground in an almost impossible pattern. From the air, they form a long, mysterious band running across the desert landscape. But who made them? And why would an ancient society spend so much effort creating something that looks almost invisible from the ground? This is Monte Sierpe, one of the strangest archaeological landscapes in Peru. Monte Sierpe lies in the Pisco Valley of southern coastal Peru, a region famous for its extremely dry climate. Rain is rare here, and that harsh environment has helped preserve archaeological remains for centuries. But Monte Sierpe is unlike a typical ruin. There are no towering pyramids, no enormous temples. Instead, there are thousands upon thousands of small depressions arranged across the landscape. From ground level, the pattern can be difficult to understand. You might see nothing more than rows of small holes disappearing into the distance, but from above, the pattern becomes extraordinary. A huge band of roughly 5,000 holes stretches across the landscape. The arrangement is not completely random. The holes appear in long rows, creating a repeating pattern that follows the terrain. It looks almost like an enormous ancient grid. And that immediately raises the biggest question. What were all those holes for? There is no surviving inscription telling us, no ancient text describing the structure, and no obvious building standing beside it. One possibility is that Monte Sierpe was connected with record-keeping or administration. Some researchers have compared the arrangement with other Andean systems used for organizing information, but the exact function remains uncertain. Another possibility is that the holes were connected with agriculture, storage, or some form of resource management. The desert environment makes water especially important. So archaeologists have also considered whether the pattern could have been related to the management of resources, but there is a problem. The holes are arranged on such a huge scale, and their exact purpose is difficult to establish from the surviving evidence alone. Imagine standing here centuries ago. There would be no modern roads, no buildings covering the landscape, just the desert, and thousands of carefully arranged depressions stretching across the ground. Someone had to create them. Again, and again, and again. The labour required to produce such a massive pattern must have been significant. That tells us something about the society behind it. Whoever constructed Monte Sierpe was capable of organising people to work on a large landscape-scale project. The site is associated with the ancient societies that occupied the Pisco Valley, a region that was home to complex communities long before the Inca Empire. Different cultures controlled the area at different times, and their settlements left behind an extraordinary archaeological record. Nearby archaeological sites include monumental architecture, burial grounds, agricultural areas, and settlements. Monte Sierpe therefore existed within a much larger cultural landscape. The desert itself is part of the story. Because the coastal valleys of Peru receive very little rainfall, archaeological features can remain visible for remarkably long periods. Wind and shifting sand still threaten them, but many ancient patterns have survived because the landscape is so dry. This is why aerial archaeology is so important here. From the ground, thousands of small holes can look meaningless. From above, their overall arrangement becomes visible. Modern aerial photography and satellite imagery have helped researchers understand the scale of Monte Sierpe, revealing patterns that are difficult to recognize at human eye level. And this creates an intriguing possibility. The people who created the feature may have understood the entire pattern, even though an individual standing inside it could never see it the way we can from the air. Perhaps the design was meant to be experienced by moving through it, rather than viewed from above. Or perhaps the pattern represented an organized system whose meaning was understood through its individual components. We simply don't know, and that uncertainty is what makes Monte Sierpe so fascinating. The holes themselves are relatively simple, a small depression, repeated thousands of times. But when those simple elements are combined, they become something enormous. This is a recurring feature of ancient archaeology. Complexity does not always require spectacular objects. Sometimes it comes from repetition, one hole, then another, until the entire landscape has been transformed. The people who created Monte Sierpe eventually disappeared. Their settlements changed, their political systems collapsed, and later civilizations occupied the same valleys. The feature remained for centuries. The desert slowly covered parts of it, but the overall pattern survived. Today, Monte Sierpe is still difficult to explain. Researchers can measure it, map it, and compare it with other archaeological features, but the original purpose remains uncertain. Was it an ancient administrative system? A place connected with agriculture? A storage or distribution system? A ritual landscape? Or something completely different? Perhaps future excavation will reveal the answer. A buried object, a nearby structure, or some overlooked detail could finally explain why thousands of holes were created here. The Monte Sierpe band of holes is remarkable because an enormous archaeological mystery can be hidden in something incredibly simple. Thousands of small holes, arranged across the Peruvian desert, creating a pattern that stretches across the landscape. We don't know exactly who created it, or why they needed such an enormous system, but the scale tells us one thing. This was not random. Someone planned it. Someone organized the labor, and someone understood why every one of those holes needed to be there. Today, the desert still preserves their mysterious design, and from the ground it may look almost ordinary, but from above, the ancient landscape reveals a pattern that still refuses to give up its secret. Moundville Earthworks. Along the banks of the Black Warrior River in Alabama, an enormous ancient settlement once stood behind massive earthen walls. More than 20 large mounds, huge plazas, homes, ceremonial buildings, and a society powerful enough to transform the landscape itself. This is Moundville, one of the most impressive ancient earthwork sites in North America. Moundville flourished between roughly the 11th and 16th centuries, long before European settlers arrived in the region. At its height, it was one of the major centers of the Mississippian world. The first thing that catches your attention is the mounds. They are not natural hills. They were built by people, layer by layer, basket by basket, using earth carried from the surrounding landscape. Some of the largest mounds rise dramatically above the surrounding ground. Others are smaller, but together they form a carefully organized settlement. And the arrangement is what makes Moundville so fascinating. The mounds surround a huge open plaza, creating a monumental central space. From above, the settlement looks almost like a carefully planned city. Imagine approaching Moundville centuries ago. You would see enormous earthen structures rising above the landscape, with people moving through the plaza, houses surrounding the open space, and ceremonial buildings standing on top of the mounds. These were not simply piles of earth. Some mounds supported important buildings, including structures associated with ceremonies and community activities. The largest mound at the site, known as Mound A, dominates the central landscape. Its enormous size shows just how much labor went into transforming the area. But perhaps the biggest mystery is not how the mounds were built. It is why they were built on such a massive scale. Moundville appears to have been a center of political and religious power. The people who controlled the settlement likely held considerable authority, and the monumental landscape may have helped express that power. The plaza would have been especially important. It created an enormous open space between the mounds, a place where large groups of people could gather. Ceremonies, public events, religious activities, and political displays may have taken place here. The mounds also created a hierarchy within the settlement. Some structures were much larger than others, and certain locations appear to have been associated with higher status activities. This suggests that Moundville was not an ordinary village. It was a complex society with social divisions, specialized roles, and leaders capable of organizing large numbers of people. Archaeologists have discovered evidence of everyday life as well. Pottery, stone tools, food remains, shell objects, and other artifacts reveal how people lived. But the pottery is especially fascinating. Mississippian craftsmen created beautifully decorated vessels, some carrying images of humans, animals, and supernatural beings. The imagery provides clues about the beliefs of the people who lived here. Birds, serpents, predators, and human figures appear in different forms, but just like many prehistoric symbols, their exact meanings are not always certain. One of the most famous objects associated with Moundville is the rattlesnake disc, a carved stone object displaying powerful symbolic imagery. It demonstrates the level of artistic skill present within the society. Other discoveries include copper ornaments, shell objects, stone tools, and ceremonial materials. Some of these materials came from regions far beyond Moundville. That means Moundville was connected to a much larger network. Goods and ideas travelled across the eastern part of North America, connecting communities separated by hundreds of kilometres. The people of Moundville were also farmers. They cultivated crops, especially maize, which became an important part of Mississippian life. Agriculture supported larger populations and allowed communities to remain in one place. But farming alone does not explain Moundville. The construction of the earthworks required enormous organisation. Thousands of loads of soil had to be moved, mounds had to be shaped, plazas maintained, buildings constructed, and the entire settlement coordinated. Without modern machinery, this would have required tremendous human effort. The earthworks therefore represent more than architecture, they represent organization. But eventually, Moundville began to change. The settlement's population declined. Political power shifted, and some of the ceremonial areas were no longer used in the same way. By the time Europeans began exploring the region, Moundville was no longer the enormous centre it had once been. Its monumental landscape remained, but the society that created it had changed dramatically. The mounds survived, grass grew over them, trees spread across parts of the landscape, and the ancient settlement slowly became less visible. Modern archaeology eventually revealed the scale of the site. Excavations uncovered houses, burials, ceremonial objects, pottery, and evidence of long-distance exchange. The discoveries changed the way many people understood ancient North America. Moundville demonstrated that complex urban and ceremonial societies had developed in the southeastern United States long before European colonization. And perhaps the most impressive thing is the landscape itself. The people did not simply build individual monuments, they redesigned an entire area. Mounds, plazas, paths, and buildings were arranged together, creating a monumental city unlike anything around it. Moundville earthworks are remarkable because they preserve the remains of a powerful ancient society that transformed the landscape using nothing more than human labour and organisation. Massive mounds rise around a central plaza. Ceremonial objects reveal a complex symbolic world, and artifacts show that Moundville was connected to communities across much of eastern North America. But the people who built this extraordinary settlement eventually moved on, their political world disappeared, and their stories were largely lost. The mounds remained, quietly standing above the Alabama landscape, and today, when you look across those enormous earthworks, you're looking at something created centuries ago by people whose names we may never know, but whose civilization is still written into the earth, the Sychite Emerald Settlement. Deep in the eastern desert of Egypt, far from the great pyramids and famous temples, an abandoned settlement sits among barren mountains, but hidden inside these mountains was something incredibly valuable: emeralds. For centuries miners came here searching through the rocks for the precious green stones, and they built an entire settlement around the mines. This is Sychite, an ancient emerald mining community buried deep in the Egyptian desert. Sychite lies within the Wadi el-Gemal region of Egypt's eastern desert, a harsh landscape of mountains, dry valleys, and almost no permanent water. Today, it looks like one of the most inhospitable places imaginable, yet ancient miners managed to live and work here for generations. The reason was hidden beneath the mountains. Emerald-bearing rocks occurred throughout the region, and the deposits became valuable enough to attract organized mining activity. The ancient miners did not simply dig shallow holes into the ground, they created tunnels, cut shafts into the mountains, and followed narrow veins of emerald-bearing material through the rock. Some of the ancient workings extend deep into the mountains. Imagine entering one of these tunnels thousands of years ago, with only lamps providing light, the walls closing in around you, and every strike of a tool potentially revealing a valuable green crystal. Mining emeralds was difficult. The stones were not simply lying on the surface waiting to be collected. Miners had to identify promising geological formations, remove rock, and carefully extract the mineral-bearing material. The environment made the work even harder. There was intense heat during the day, cold temperatures at night, and very limited access to water. Yet people continued coming here. That tells us something about the value of the emeralds. The rewards were important enough to justify operating mines in an extremely difficult environment. Around the mines, a settlement developed. Stone buildings were constructed among the mountains, providing spaces for workers, storage, processing, and other activities connected with mining. The remains of houses and larger structures can still be seen across the site. Some buildings were constructed on terraces, adapting to the steep mountain landscape. The settlement therefore became more than a mine. It was an industrial community, a place where people lived, worked, processed materials, and supported the mining operation. One of the most interesting structures at Sychite is a large building sometimes called the Sychite tripartite building. Its exact function remains uncertain, but its size and location suggest that it had an important role within the settlement. Other buildings may have served as homes or workshops. The archaeological remains provide clues about how people organised their lives around the mines. The emeralds themselves were not necessarily the only valuable material being extracted. The region was part of a wider mineral-rich desert landscape, where ancient communities exploited different stones and resources. But emeralds gave Sikite a special importance. Green stones were highly valued in the ancient world, and Egyptian emeralds became particularly famous. The mines were especially important during the Ptolemaic and Roman periods, when Egypt was connected to enormous trade networks across the Mediterranean and beyond. Emeralds could become luxury objects, jewellery, amulets, or symbols of wealth and status. A small stone extracted from this remote desert could eventually travel hundreds or thousands of kilometres. Imagine the journey. A miner finds a green crystal deep inside the mountain. The stone is removed, carried out of the desert, transported along trade routes, and eventually placed into the hands of someone living far from the mine. That tiny emerald connected two completely different worlds, the harsh desert mine and the wealthy markets of the ancient world. The settlement also reveals the human cost of obtaining such luxury. Mining was physically demanding, dangerous, and required people to work underground in confined spaces. Ancient tools and mining traces help archaeologists understand the techniques used. Workers could exploit natural fractures in the rock, follow mineral veins, and expand tunnels when promising deposits were discovered. But the miners did not always know what they would find. Some tunnels ended without producing significant amounts of emerald. Others followed productive veins deeper into the mountain. This made mining a mixture of knowledge, experience, and risk. The desert also helped preserve the settlement. With very little rainfall, stone buildings could survive for centuries. Collapsed walls, mining shafts, and abandoned structures remained visible across the landscape. Eventually, the mines were abandoned. The reasons were probably connected with changing economic conditions, shifting political control, and the availability of other sources of emerald. Without the mining activity, there was little reason for people to remain in such a remote environment. The settlement became silent. The miners left. The workshops stopped. The tunnels were abandoned, and the desert slowly reclaimed the site. For centuries, the mountains kept their secret. The abandoned settlement remained scattered across the valleys, while the emerald deposits continued to lie underground. Modern archaeology eventually began documenting Sikite, mapping the mines, studying the buildings, and reconstructing the ancient mining landscape. The discoveries revealed that this was not simply a collection of old mine shafts. It was an organized community built around one of the ancient world's most valuable gemstones. And perhaps the most fascinating part is the contrast. The emeralds were beautiful, bright green, and associated with wealth. But the place where they were found was almost completely the opposite: dry, rocky, remote, and brutally harsh. The Sikite Emerald Settlement is remarkable because an entire ancient community grew in one of Egypt's most unforgiving landscapes, all because of tiny green stones hidden inside the mountains. Miners descended into dark tunnels, workers processed the material, and traders carried the valuable emeralds far beyond the desert. Eventually, the settlement was abandoned. The people disappeared, but the mines remained. Today, the ruined buildings and ancient tunnels still sit among the mountains, a reminder that thousands of years ago, people were willing to cross one of the harshest landscapes on Earth just to reach the emeralds hidden beneath the stone. Wadi al-Hitan, Whale Valley. Deep in Egypt's western desert, hundreds of kilometers from the open sea, scientists discovered something that seems completely out of place: the skeletons of ancient whales. Not one, but an extraordinary concentration of fossils scattered across the desert floor. Some still preserve tiny hind limbs, remnants from a time when the ancestors of whales were making one of the most dramatic transformations in evolutionary history. This is Wadi al-Hitan, the Valley of the Whales. Today, Wadi al-Hitan is a dry and barren landscape in Egypt's western desert. Sandstone cliffs rise above the valley. Wind moves across the desert, and almost nothing about the landscape suggests that whales should ever have lived here. But roughly 40 million years ago, this place looked completely different. Much of the region was covered by an ancient sea. Warm water stretched across areas that are now desert, supporting sharks, fish, marine reptiles, and early whales. When these animals died, some of their bodies sank into sediments on the seafloor, over millions of years. Those sediments hardened into rock, the sea disappeared, the landscape changed, and erosion eventually exposed the fossils again. What remained was extraordinary. Entire whale skeletons began appearing from the desert. Vertebrae, skulls, ribs, jaws, and in some remarkable specimens, tiny hind limbs. Those small legs are one of the reasons Wadi al-Hitan became so important. Modern whales have bodies completely adapted for life in water, but their distant ancestors evolved from land-dwelling mammals. That transformation did not happen instantly. Across millions of years, their bodies changed, their forelimbs became flippers, their swimming abilities improved, their bodies became increasingly adapted to marine life, and their hind limbs gradually became reduced. The fossils at Wadi al-Hitan preserve an important stage in that transition. Among the most famous whales discovered here are Basilosaurus and Dorudon. Basilosaurus was enormous. Despite its misleading name, it was not a reptile, it was an ancient whale. Some individuals reached lengths of well over 15 meters, with long, narrow bodies unlike most whales alive today. But hidden near the rear of the body were tiny hind limbs. They were far too small to support the animal on land. By this point, Basilosaurus was already completely aquatic. Yet those reduced limbs remained. Evolution had transformed them from functional walking legs into tiny remnants of an earlier ancestry. And that makes the fossils incredibly powerful. You don't have to imagine the transition only from genetic evidence or diagrams. At Wadi al-Hitan, part of that evolutionary story is preserved directly in stone. Dorudon was smaller, but its fossils are equally important. Multiple individuals have been discovered, including young animals. This has helped researchers reconstruct more than anatomy. It provides clues about how these whales lived, how they developed, and how different species interacted within the ancient marine ecosystem. Other fossils reveal the world surrounding them: sharks, fish, turtles, crocodilians, and other marine animals once inhabited these waters. So when scientists study Wadi al-Hitan, they are not simply studying individual whale skeletons, they are reconstructing an entire vanished ecosystem. Imagine standing here 40 million years ago. Instead of desert, water surrounds you. Large whales move through the sea, predators hunt beneath the surface, and sediments slowly accumulate on the seabed. Then, over an almost unimaginable amount of time, the environment changes, the water retreats, sediments become rock, tectonic and climatic processes reshape the region, and the former seafloor eventually becomes desert. Millions of years later, wind and erosion begin exposing the skeletons. Whales that once swam through an ancient ocean now lie surrounded by sand. And some of the fossils are remarkably complete. Instead of isolated bones, researchers have found articulated skeletons where many bones remain close to their original positions. That level of preservation allows scientists to study proportions, movement, anatomy, and evolutionary relationships in extraordinary detail. The fossils also help answer one of the biggest questions about whales. How did an animal whose ancestors walked on land become one of the most specialized marine mammals on Earth? Wadi al-Hitan preserves part of the answer. The hind limbs were shrinking, the body was becoming increasingly adapted for swimming, and these animals had already become permanent inhabitants of the sea. This transformation took millions of years. There was no single moment when a land animal suddenly became a whale. Instead, generation after generation, small changes accumulated. Eventually, the descendants of these ancient animals became completely different from their terrestrial ancestors. Modern whales would emerge from that much longer evolutionary story. Wadi al-Hitan is now recognized as one of the world's most important fossil locations. Its exceptional evidence for whale evolution led to its designation as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. But perhaps what makes Whale Valley so unforgettable is not just the science, it is the landscape. You can stand in the middle of an enormous Egyptian desert, look down, and find the remains of an animal that once swam through an ocean. The contrast almost feels impossible. Sand beneath your feet, cliffs surrounding you, no ocean anywhere on the horizon, and the skeleton of a whale lying in the desert. Wadi al-Hitan is remarkable because it preserves a chapter of Earth's history that would otherwise be almost impossible to imagine. Long before humans, long before Egypt's pyramids, and long before the Sahara looked anything like it does today, whales were swimming above this landscape. Some still carried tiny remnants of the legs their ancestors once used on land. Then the sea vanished. Millions of years passed, and their skeletons emerged again beneath the desert sun. Today, those fossils preserve something extraordinary. Not a lost civilization, not an ancient tomb, but the remains of a transformation that took millions of years, when the ancestors of whales left the land behind and became creatures of the sea. Emerald Mound. In the forests of Mississippi, an enormous earthen monument rises above the landscape. At first, it looks like a natural hill, but it isn't. This massive structure was built entirely by human hands, long before European settlers arrived in North America. This is Emerald Mound, one of the largest prehistoric platform mounds in the United States. Emerald Mound was built by people of the Mississippian culture around 1,000 years ago. The site covers a huge area, and its main platform rises dramatically above the surrounding ground. But the most impressive part is what lies on top. The mound wasn't simply one giant pile of earth. Its summit contains smaller raised platforms, creating a complex arrangement of elevated spaces. Imagine approaching Emerald Mound when it was still in use. The enormous earthwork would have dominated the surrounding landscape, with structures standing on its elevated summit and people gathering around the base. The amount of earth required to build it was enormous. Workers had to collect soil, carry it, place it, and repeatedly compact it to create stable layers. There were no trucks, no excavators, no modern construction equipment. The entire monument was created through organized human labor. That alone tells us something about the society that built it. A project this large required planning, leadership, and enough people working together to move huge quantities of earth. Emerald Mound was not an isolated monument. It belonged to a much larger settlement and ceremonial landscape. Nearby communities were connected through agriculture, trade, religion, and political relationships. The Mississippian people relied heavily on farming, especially crops such as maize. Agriculture helped support larger populations, allowing some communities to become major political and ceremonial centers. The mound itself may have supported important buildings, perhaps the residences of leaders, ceremonial structures, or spaces connected with religious activities. Exactly what happened on every platform remains uncertain. The buildings that once stood there have disappeared, leaving archaeologists to reconstruct their purpose from the surviving earthworks and archaeological evidence. But the elevated position was almost certainly significant. Raising structures above the surrounding landscape created a powerful visual effect. It separated important spaces from ordinary living areas, and made the monument visible from far away. The name Emerald Mound can be misleading. It has nothing to do with emerald gemstones. The name comes from the nearby emerald plantation, not from the people who originally built the monument. The ancient builders had their own names for their places, but those names were not preserved in written records. This is one of the challenges of studying the Mississippian world. The people created enormous monuments, but they left behind very few written records explaining them. Instead, archaeologists rely on the earthworks, pottery, tools, burials, food remains, and other objects. Together, these clues reveal a complex society. The architecture also shows that the builders understood how to work with the landscape. The mound was constructed from carefully selected earth, layered and shaped to create a stable platform. Over time, the monument was modified, different layers were added, platforms expanded, and the settlement around it changed. This means Emerald Mound was not necessarily built in one single event. It may have developed over generations, with each generation adding something to the monument. That makes the mound almost like a historical record, Every layer represents another period of activity, another group of workers, and another stage in the life of the community. Eventually, the Mississippian settlement system began to change. Political centers declined, populations moved, and traditional ceremonial landscapes were transformed. Emerald Mound was eventually abandoned. The buildings disappeared, vegetation covered the earthworks, and the monument became part of the surrounding forest. For centuries, the massive structure remained, trees grew. Across its slopes, soil eroded, and parts of the original form changed, but the basic monument survived. Modern archaeology eventually documented and protected the site, allowing researchers to study the enormous earthwork and its relationship with other Mississippian sites. And when you stand beside Emerald Mound, its scale becomes much easier to appreciate. This is not a small burial mound, it is a massive engineered landscape. The builders took ordinary earth, something that seems almost worthless, and transformed it into a monumental structure. No stone blocks were required, no marble, no bronze, no elaborate carved walls, just earth, layer after layer, until the ground itself had been reshaped. Emerald Mound is remarkable because it shows how powerful architecture can be, even when it is made from the simplest material. The people who built it created enormous platforms, placed important structures above the surrounding landscape, and transformed the Mississippi Valley through collective labor. Their names are largely forgotten, their buildings are gone, and many of their beliefs remain difficult to reconstruct. But the mound survived. Today, it still rises above the landscape, a massive reminder of a civilization that once flourished across North America, and proof that sometimes the greatest monuments of the ancient world weren't built from stone, they were built from earth. The Caddo Mounds Ceremonial Center. Caddo Mounds lies in the Neches River Valley of eastern Texas, a region of forests, rivers, and fertile land. For centuries, the Caddo people lived across parts of what are now Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, and Oklahoma. They developed permanent settlements, farming communities, long-distance trade, and complex religious traditions. At Caddo Mounds, the most visible remains are three major earthworks. Each mound had a different role within the ceremonial center. The largest was the Great Temple Mound, another was the Burial Mound, and the third was the Ceremonial Mound. These were not natural hills. They were carefully constructed from layers of earth, basket by basket, load by load, until the landscape itself had been transformed. The Great Temple Mound was particularly important. A structure once stood on top, elevated above the surrounding settlement. From the summit, the people using the mound would have overlooked the surrounding landscape. This elevated position may have been connected with religious ceremonies, political authority, or both. In the Caddo world, religion and leadership were deeply connected. Imagine approaching the ceremonial center centuries ago. You would see the enormous mound rising ahead, buildings on top, people gathering around the open spaces, and activities taking place throughout the settlement. The mounds were not isolated monuments. They formed part of a carefully organized ceremonial landscape. The burial mound contained human remains, showing that the site was also connected with the treatment of the dead. Burial practices can reveal important information about Caddo beliefs, social status, and relationships between the living and their ancestors. The people buried here were not simply forgotten individuals. Their burial within the ceremonial landscape suggests that the dead remained connected to the community. The Caddo were also highly skilled farmers. They cultivated maize and other crops, while hunting, fishing, and gathering additional resources from the surrounding environment. The fertile river valley provided the foundation for permanent settlement. But agriculture alone does not explain the construction of the mounds. Large ceremonial monuments required organization, labor, and leadership. People had to collect enormous quantities of soil, transport it, shape the mound, and maintain the structures over generations. This tells us that Caddo society was highly organized. Communities could work together on projects that transformed the landscape, and religious centers could become powerful places within the wider social system. Archaeologists have also found pottery. stone tools, burial objects, and other artifacts at Caddo sites. Their pottery is particularly distinctive, often decorated with carefully designed patterns. The Caddo were also part of extensive trade networks. Materials and objects moved across large parts of the southern United States. This meant that the ceremonial centre was connected to a much wider world. Ideas travelled, objects travelled, and people travelled. But the most important thing about Caddo mounds may be its spiritual role. The site was not simply a place where people lived, it was a place where people gathered, performed ceremonies, buried important individuals, and expressed their understanding of the world. Much of that belief system is difficult to reconstruct today. The Caddo had oral traditions, but those traditions were not written down by the people who originally built the mounds. Archaeologists therefore have to study the physical evidence, the arrangement of the mounds, the burials, the artifacts, and the broader landscape. And there is another reason Caddo mounds is important. The site remained connected with Caddo identity long after the original mound-building period. The Caddo people survived, even as political boundaries and outside pressures transformed their world. European arrival brought enormous changes. Disease, displacement, conflict, and colonization dramatically affected Caddo communities. Yet the people themselves did not simply disappear. Modern Caddo communities continue to preserve their cultural identity and traditions. The ancient mounds therefore belong to a living history, not simply a vanished civilization. Today, the earthworks still rise above the Texas landscape. The forests have changed, the surrounding settlements have changed, but the monumental forms remain. Standing beside them, it is difficult to imagine how much labour went into their construction. There are no enormous stone blocks, no carved statues, no towering walls, just earth. Yet that earth was enough to create a ceremonial landscape that has survived for centuries. Caddo mounds is remarkable because it preserves the remains of a sophisticated indigenous society that transformed the landscape through ceremony, farming, trade, and collective labour. 3 major mounds, a ceremonial centre, burials, and evidence of a culture that flourished across the southern United States long before European colonization. The people who built these earthworks understood this landscape differently from the world around us today. To them, these mounds were not simply hills, they were places of ceremony, power, memory, and connection with the ancestors. And even after centuries of change, the mounds remain, quietly standing in the Texas landscape, preserving the memory of a people whose story is still alive. Pueblo Bonito, Chaco Canyon. Deep inside the deserts of New Mexico, a massive stone complex rises from the canyon floor. Hundreds of rooms, multi-story walls, great circular chambers buried within the ruins, and an enormous settlement built by people who lived here nearly 1,000 years ago. This is Pueblo Bonito, the largest and most famous great house in Chaco Canyon. Chaco Canyon lies in the high desert of northwestern New Mexico, a landscape of sandstone cliffs, open plains, and an environment where water has always been precious. Yet between roughly the 9th and 13th centuries, the canyon became the center of a remarkable civilization. At the heart of it was Pueblo Bonito. The structure is enormous, with more than 600 rooms arranged around large open plazas. From above, its distinctive shape almost looks like a giant curved arc of stone. But Pueblo Bonito was not built all at once. It developed over generations. Rooms were added, walls were expanded, and the complex gradually became larger and more sophisticated. The builders used carefully shaped sandstone blocks, stacking them into thick masonry walls. Some sections originally rose several stories high. Imagine approaching Pueblo Bonito when it was still occupied. The canyon would have looked completely different. People moving between rooms, smoke rising from fires, goods being stored, and groups gathering in the enormous open spaces. But some of the most mysterious structures are hidden inside. These are the kivas, large circular, partly underground spaces used for ceremonial activities. Kivas are one of the defining features of Chacan architecture. Some are relatively small, while others are enormous. Their exact ceremonies cannot be reconstructed completely, but they clearly had important social and religious roles. The presence of so many ceremonial spaces suggests that Pueblo Bonito was much more than an ordinary residential village. It was a center of community, ceremony, and regional influence. And Pueblo Bonito was not alone. Across Chaco Canyon, other enormous great houses were constructed. They were connected by roads, architecture, and a wider system of settlements. Some of these roads are remarkably straight, crossing difficult terrain for long distances. Why would people build such roads through a harsh desert? That remains one of the fascinating questions surrounding Chaco. The canyon appears to have been at the center of a much larger regional network. People traveled between settlements, materials moved across long distances, and communities participated in shared architectural and ceremonial traditions. Archaeologists have discovered materials at Pueblo Bonito that originated far from Chaco: turquoise, shell, macaws, and other exotic goods reached the canyon through long-distance exchange networks. The presence of macaw remains is especially striking. These tropical birds came from regions far to the south, meaning they had been transported hundreds or even thousands of kilometers. So Pueblo Bonito was connected to a much wider world. The desert settlement was not isolated. The people who lived here also developed sophisticated systems for managing scarce resources. Water had to be collected and stored, food had to be produced or transported, and the population had to survive in an unpredictable environment. Yet the canyon's climate was challenging. Periods of drought could place enormous pressure on communities, and eventually, Chaco's great system began to change. By the late 12th and early 13th centuries, major construction declined. People began leaving the canyon, and the great houses were no longer occupied in the same way. The exact reasons remain debated. Drought, environmental pressure, social changes, political transformation, or a combination of factors may have contributed. But abandonment did not mean that Chaco suddenly became meaningless. The canyon remained important to indigenous peoples, and Pueblo communities today maintain cultural connections to the wider Chaco landscape. That is an important part of the story. Pueblo Bonito is not simply a dead ancient city. Its history continues through the descendants and living traditions of indigenous peoples of the Southwest. Modern archaeology has revealed enormous amounts of information about the site. Excavations have uncovered pottery, tools, food remains, burials, architectural features, and objects transported from distant regions. The architecture itself continues to raise questions. Why were so many rooms constructed? How were the buildings organized? Who lived in them? And what exactly happened inside the enormous ceremonial spaces? Some rooms may have been residential, others used for storage, craft production, or ceremonies, but the function of individual spaces could change over time. And then there is the scale. Pueblo Bonito required an enormous investment of labor. Sandstone had to be quarried, blocks shaped, walls constructed, and buildings maintained for generations. The people who built it had no modern machinery, yet they created a complex that still dominates the canyon today. Pueblo Bonito is remarkable because it shows the extraordinary architectural and social achievements of the ancient peoples of the American Southwest. Hundreds of rooms, massive stone walls, great kivas, long-distance trade, and a network of settlements stretching far beyond the canyon itself. Eventually, the great house was abandoned, the people moved on, and the desert slowly reclaimed the buildings, but Pueblo Bonito remained. Its walls still stand beneath the New Mexico sky, preserving the remains of a society whose architecture continues to raise questions. Because when you look at this enormous stone complex, one question becomes impossible to ignore. How did people living in the middle of this harsh desert build something this extraordinary? Bandolier alcove dwellings, high above the floor of a canyon in New Mexico. Ancient homes are carved directly into the volcanic cliffs. Small rooms, stone walls, ladders climbing toward the rock, and deep alcoves that once sheltered entire communities. This is Bandolier, a remarkable landscape where people turned enormous natural caves into homes. Bandolier lies in northern New Mexico, among steep canyon walls shaped by ancient volcanic activity. The cliffs are made largely from soft volcanic rock called tuff, a material that can be surprisingly easy to carve compared with harder stone, and the people who lived here knew exactly how to use it. Instead of building everything from the ground up, they carved into the cliffs themselves, Natural alcoves became living spaces, cavities were enlarged, and stone walls were constructed inside the enormous rock shelters. The result is a settlement unlike a typical ancient village. Homes are stacked vertically across the canyon walls, connected by narrow trails, stone steps, and wooden ladders. Imagine living here centuries ago. To reach your home, you might climb a ladder several meters above the canyon floor. Below you, the landscape stretches through the canyon. Above you, the cliff rises into the sky. The natural alcoves provided protection from the elements, while the surrounding canyon offered access to water, plants, animals, and other resources. But the inhabitants did not simply occupy the caves, they transformed them. Rooms were constructed, walls were plastered, fireplaces were built, and the volcanic rock was carved into additional spaces. Some structures were multi-room complexes, while others were small living spaces. Together, they created communities adapted to an unusually vertical landscape. The people associated with the ancient settlements of Bandelier were part of the wider ancestral Pueblo world of the American Southwest. They farmed, hunted, gathered wild foods, and developed sophisticated traditions of architecture and community life. Agriculture was especially important. Crops such as maize, beans, and squash could be grown in suitable areas. But farming in the Southwest required careful adaptation to the environment. Water was precious, and the landscape could be unpredictable. The canyon environment provided both opportunities and challenges. The cliffs offered shelter, but the steep terrain made movement difficult. The inhabitants had to understand the landscape intimately. One of the most fascinating features is the network of ladders. The people could move vertically between different levels of the settlement, reaching homes, ceremonial spaces, and agricultural areas. To a modern visitor, the climb can feel difficult. For the people who lived here, it would have been part of everyday life. Children, adults, and families would have moved through this landscape regularly. The cliff dwellings also reveal something about community organization. Building walls, carving rooms, maintaining structures, and managing food supplies required cooperation. And then there are the kivas, ceremonial spaces that played important roles in ancestral Pueblo communities. Some were built into the landscape near the cliff dwellings. These spaces may have been used for ceremonies, community gatherings, and religious activities. Their importance goes far beyond simple architecture. But the people who used them did not leave behind written explanations. We cannot know exactly what every ceremony involved, or what every symbol meant. Archaeologists must reconstruct their world through architecture, artifacts, and living indigenous traditions. The canyon also preserves evidence of everyday life: pottery fragments, stone tools, grinding stones, and other objects reveal how people prepared food, made tools, and carried out ordinary activities. These small discoveries are important. A massive cliff dwelling shows us how people built, but a broken pot or grinding stone can tell us how they lived. Over generations, the communities changed. Buildings were expanded, some spaces were abandoned, and new structures were constructed. The canyon became a layered record of human activity. Eventually, many of the settlements were abandoned. The reasons were complex and may have included environmental changes, drought, resource pressures, and broader social transformations. But abandonment did not mean the people simply vanished. Ancestral Pueblo communities moved and reorganized across the Southwest, and their descendants remain part of the living indigenous cultures of the region today. The canyon continued to preserve their old homes. Wind moved through the alcoves, rain slowly weathered the volcanic walls, and vegetation returned to the abandoned structures. Modern archaeology later revealed just how extensive the settlements had been. Researchers documented hundreds of rooms, cliff dwellings, ceremonial spaces, and other features spread throughout the canyon. And perhaps the most remarkable thing is that the architecture works with the natural landscape. The cliffs are not merely a background, they are part of the buildings. The people used the rock, carved it, built against it, and turned natural spaces into homes. Bandelier alcove dwellings are remarkable because they show how people adapted architecture to one of the most dramatic landscapes in the American Southwest. Instead of flattening the land, they climbed it. Instead of building entirely separate structures, they carved into the cliffs, and instead of treating the enormous volcanic alcoves as empty spaces, they transformed them into homes, gathering places and communities. The people eventually moved on, but their rooms remained carved into the canyon walls, stone foundations, blackened fireplaces, ancient pathways, and ladder holes still preserve traces of everyday life. And standing beneath those enormous cliffs today, it's easy to imagine the ancient settlement coming alive again, with people climbing the rock, moving between homes and living high above the canyon floor. The Cerro Sechin stone reliefs, on the northern coast of Peru, a massive stone wall is covered with disturbing human figures, warriors, severed heads, bodies, and strange scenes carved into stone more than 4,000 years ago. This is Cerro Sechin, one of the most mysterious ceremonial sites of ancient Peru. Cerro Sechin stands in the Casma Valley of Peru, a landscape of dry mountains and desert valleys where ancient communities developed some of the earliest monumental architecture in the Andes. The site dates back to around 2000 BC, long before the Inca, long before the famous Nazca culture, and centuries before the great civilizations that would later dominate the Andes. But what makes Cerro Sechin so unusual are the stones. More than 100 carved stone slabs were placed around the site's monumental structures, and many of them show human figures in scenes of extreme violence. Some figures appear to be warriors, others appear to be prisoners or victims. There are severed heads, disembodied limbs, and bodies shown in disturbing detail. The imagery is unlike the peaceful scenes we might expect from an ancient ceremonial centre. Instead, the walls seem to present a world of conflict, death, and power. But what exactly are we looking at? That's where the mystery begins. The carvings do not come with a surviving written explanation. There is no inscription telling us what happened, who these people were, or why the scenes were placed around the monument. One possibility is that the reliefs depict a real conflict. Perhaps a victorious group recorded its defeat of an enemy, displaying captured warriors and victims as a warning to others. Another interpretation is that the imagery was connected with ritual sacrifice, ceremonial violence, or religious beliefs surrounding death, but archaeologists continue to debate the exact meaning. The stone reliefs are also fascinating because of their age. Cerro Sechin was created thousands of years before the better-known civilizations of the Andes. This means that complex monumental art, ceremonial architecture, and powerful visual symbolism were already developing in ancient Peru. The people who built Cerro Sechin were not simply wandering groups. They were capable of constructing large architectural complexes, transporting enormous stones, and organizing skilled craftsmen. The carved slabs themselves required remarkable effort. Each stone had to be selected, transported, positioned, and carved using stone tools. The artist then removed sections of the surface to reveal the figures. Some of the carvings are surprisingly detailed. Muscles, hands, faces, weapons, and human body parts are represented with deliberate precision. The repeated imagery creates an overwhelming effect. Imagine standing beside the monument thousands of years ago, surrounded by stone figures depicting violence and death. The message must have been powerful. But was it meant to frighten people, celebrate victory, represent a religious story, or communicate something about the relationship between humans and supernatural forces? We simply don't know. The monument itself may provide another clue. The reliefs were incorporated into the architecture, meaning the images were not simply individual artworks, they were part of the building. The stone walls, the plazas, the stairways, and the carved figures work together as one monumental environment. This suggests that visitors may have moved through the complex in a particular way, encountering the images as they approached important spaces. The architecture could therefore control what people saw, and when they saw it. The Casma Valley was also an important region for ancient settlement. Communities cultivated crops, managed water, built monumental structures, and developed complex social systems. The ability to construct Cerro Sechin suggests that some people held enough authority to organize large groups of workers. Farmers, builders, stoneworkers, and artists all had to contribute. This raises another question. Who controlled the monument? Was it a local ruling elite, a religious authority, or a community working together for a shared purpose? The stone. Carvings may have been part of that system of power, Images of defeated enemies or sacrificed bodies could communicate authority, showing what happened to those who challenged the established order. But this remains an interpretation. Without written records, we cannot confidently reconstruct the political system behind the monument. Eventually, the ceremonial complex was abandoned, the buildings deteriorated, the stones fell, and the site was gradually covered by the desert landscape. Thousands of years passed. New societies rose across Peru, new monumental centers appeared, and the meaning of Cerro disappeared from living memory. Then, modern archaeology began uncovering it again. The carved stones emerged from the earth, revealing scenes that had remained hidden for centuries. The discovery changed the understanding of early Andean civilization. It showed that complex monumental art and organized ceremonial architecture existed much earlier than many people had assumed. And perhaps the most haunting feature is the silence behind the images. The artists carefully carved every detail, but they left us no explanation. We can see the violence, but we don't know the story. We can see the victims, but we don't know their identities. We can see the monument, but we don't know exactly what ceremonies took place there.